I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to episode 32. This episode is actually part 2 of the Mount Shasta Weirdness that started last week with part 1. Part 1 was the episode where we talked about 3 different mysterious disappearances that have taken place on Mount Shasta. Most notably, we discussed the missing 411 case of Carl Landers. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, you might want to go back and listen to that one first. It has some information about the mountain and its history that I'm going to recap here a little bit, but not in the same detail. One of the 3 cases we talked about last week had involved a 3-year-old boy who went missing and had claimed that robots had taken him and were doing experiments on him in a cave full of spiders. There is another story that said that during the same month that this boy went missing, there was a Los Angeles man who was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail when he heard the singing of a female voice coming from the direction of Mount Shasta. He wandered off the trail to follow the voice and became lost in the woods. He claims that he was abducted and taken to a dark chamber in a cave and stripped of all his clothing. A tall female with unnatural blue eyes and strange clothing appeared and gave him a gift and secret information which he has declined to share. I wonder what the gift was. He was reportedly lost for several weeks, and after surviving his ordeal, he believed that he was the incarnation of a Hindu god and changed his name to Lord Kalki. An odd story, but one that I wanted to include because it did specifically mention the boy who went missing at the age of 3. I believe it was September of 2011. I don't have my notes on that case, but I'm fairly certain that was the time frame. The main case that we talked about last week was the missing 411 case of Carl Landers, who went missing in 1999 and was never found. As of today's date of recording, which I am recording the Monday before this releases, no sign of Carl has ever been found. He just vanished along with all of his personal items that he carried with him. Since Carl has gone missing, there have been other hikers who have gone missing, and they have been found. During the searches for these other missing hikers, still no sign of Carl has ever shown up. No remains, no clothing, nothing he was carrying with him, his ice axe, his hiking boots, his crampons, and he was reportedly wearing 3 layers of clothing, so that's quite a bit of clothing to never see. It's basically like he vanished completely off of the mountain. While I was researching the Carl Landers case, I ended up going down the proverbial rabbit hole of strangeness that is Mount Shasta. I don't know how else to really describe it. It's just a crazy amount of odd, weird, and woo-woo stuff that is associated with this mountain. In fact, while I was preparing for the notes for this episode, I was still double checking some things and looking up things, and I kept finding more information, and finally I just had to stop. In researching for this episode, there were 2 Kindle books that I was reading. One was Mount Shasta Sightings by Brian Wallenstein, and the other was Mysteries of Mount Shasta, Home of the Underground Dwellers and Ancient Gods by Timothy Beckley. I will make sure that I include links to both of those books in the show notes. So Mount Shasta, to recap, is part of the Cascade Range that includes Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, and Mount Adams. You might remember Mount Adams from episode 3, the UFO Ranch, because that is the mountain that is right there at the ranch. It stands over 14,000 feet tall, and it's a stratovolcano currently surveyed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and it's considered a high-threat volcano. The oldest known human settlement in the area of Mount Shasta dates back 7,000 years. There were several Native American tribes that live or have lived in the area, and they include, and I will do my best to pronounce these correctly, the Shasta, Okwachu, Modoc, Achomawi, Atsugewi, the Karuk, the Klamath, the Wintu, and the Yana. Native Americans play a large role in the history and mysteries of the mountain. They've lived in the area for thousands of years and even talked about underground tunnels between southern Oregon, Mount Shasta, and the upper coasts of California. Some tribes have admitted that the locations and entrances of these tunnels are a closely guarded secret that has never been shared with the outside world. It is a fact that the region surrounding Mount Shasta contains thousands of caves, most of which have never even been explored. The Native Americans in the area generally felt that Mount Shasta was a sacred place. While the area near the base of the mountains was inhabited with indigenous people, no one lived or ventured past the tree line. This area was considered especially sacred and belonged to Grandfather. The Shasta tribe in particular considered the summit to be sacred, and only shamans and spirits of the dead ventured there. One Native American story says that the Great Spirit made Mount Shasta. He first pushed snow and ice from the skies through a hole that he made in the blue heavens by turning a stone round and round until he made the great mountaintop. Then he descended and planted trees all around by putting his finger in the ground. One of the most interesting Native American stories deals with a great storm that was going on at the summit of Mount Shasta. The Great Spirit sent his youngest and fairest daughter to go up to the hole to talk to the storm and tell it to be more gentle or it would blow the mountain over. He told her not to put her head out too far or the wind would catch her hair and blow her away. She did as she was told, but she had never seen the ocean before, so she put her head out and the wind caught her and blew her out and away down the mountainside. She could not get a foothold in the ice and snow, and she slid to the trees. Now, the grizzly bears possessed the woods down to the sea at that time. They were covered all in hair, but lived in caves. They had sharp claws, but walked on two legs. They talked, and they used clubs to fight with. They were numerous and powerful. One grizzly family lived near the snow line, and the father found the daughter of the Great Spirit and took her home to the mother grizzly. They raised her as their own with their cubs, and when they were of age, the oldest grizzly son married the daughter of the Great Spirit, and they had many children that were considered to be the first Indians. The Great Spirit was angry they had created a new race and forced the grizzlies not to speak and to kneel, which left them walking on all fours. Many of the tribes considered Mount Shasta as their birthplace because of this legend. It's an interesting description of the grizzlies from that time. The description is along the same lines as descriptions of Bigfoot. Is it possible they could be one and the same? Who knows? When the Native Americans began settling the area thousands of years ago, they found it was already occupied by the Shasta people, who were shorter with dark hair and brown skin. The Shasta people fought to try to keep their land, but the Native Americans were too numerous and drove the Shastas away. The survivors left in canoes to try to find their original homeland, but never found it because it had been completely covered over by water. There's also a legend about the little people or fairies of the woods called the Axki, who would inflict pain on unsavory people who disrespected nature and other beings. They live amongst the rocks and cliffs on the mountain, and they can appear and disappear at will. The mountain has a lot of strange and mystical things associated with it, in addition to the Native American myths and legends. Some say that Mount Shasta is on a ley line. We mentioned ley lines back in the Owlman episode, which was episode 6. Ley lines are intentionally straight alignments that connect various historic structures and prominent landmarks. Not everyone believes in them or agrees that they even exist. They are basically lines that crisscross the globe like latitude and longitude that are dotted with monuments and natural landforms and carry along with them rivers of supernatural energy. Along these lines, at the places they intersect, there are pockets of concentrated energy that can be harnessed by certain individuals. Mount Kailash in the Himalayas, the Haleakala volcano in Maui, Hawaii, Lake Titicaca in Peru, and the Ayers Rock in Australia are all natural locations that fall on ley lines. I have no problem saying Titicaca because as a kid I thought it was hilarious. I'm sorry. Many man-made places also fall on ley lines, and they were kind of mentioned in episode 6. So different churches, temples, Stonehenge, they fall in ley lines as well. I don't want to get too caught up in that. Areas where these lines cross are known to be locations of spiritual vortexes or vortices that are areas known for supernatural events, unexplained phenomena, and being spiritual supercenters. People longing for spiritual growth and healing frequently visit Mount Shasta because it's said that Mount Shasta has an extremely potent energy that awakens the crown chakra, enabling a higher connection to oneself. The Native American tribes all recognized that Mount Shasta was sacred and powerful. They all had shamans, but the Pit River, or the Achumawi Indians in particular, considered Mount Shasta to be a power spot and went there to seek out spirits called the Tinihowi, who lived on the mountain and provided power and guidance. The Tinihowi were described as tall, long-haired, etheric beings who lived somewhere above the tree line. This is a good segue into the next legend that I want to touch upon, and that is the legend of the Lemurians, who are said to live inside the mountain. In the mid-19th century, paleontologists coined the term Lemuria to describe a hypothetical continent bridging the Indian Ocean that would explain the migration of lemurs from Madagascar to India. Lemuria was a continent which submerged and was no longer seen. It's also equated with the lost continent of Mu, said to be the Pacific's version of Atlantis. Lemuria, or Mu, is corroborated by native Hawaiians. It was a landmass that was lost under the Pacific Ocean. The survivors fled to the area of Mount Shasta, where they took up residence. There's a complex system of tunnels that leads to the lost ancient city of Telos, which is home to the Lemurian civilization. The Native Americans talk of secret tunnels underground, and there are known lava tubes that are large enough for a man to walk into. The Lemurians are said to still live under or inside Mount Shasta even today. One description says that the Lemurians are 7 feet tall, with long flowing hair, and wearing white robes and sandals. The most recent sighting that I found was dated back to the 1940s. But to pull it back to the Native Americans, the Tinihowi were described as tall, long-haired, etheric beings. So, similar description in these two beings that are being described, the Lemurians and the Tinihowi. So, perhaps they're one and the same. So, in 1940, there is a sighting of a Lemurian who went into a nearby general store to buy supplies, and they paid for their purchases with chunks of gold. The shop owner went to try to give them change, but when he turned around to hand it to him, the Lemurian was gone. And it seemed almost as if they really had little need for gold. Like the value of the gold had little meaning to them. For us, gold is very valuable, but to the Lemurians, it was almost like, here, take this shiny gold rock in exchange for, 3 packs of spaghetti. I don't know if they bought spaghetti. I have no idea what they bought. Maybe some beef jerky, some Mr. Pibb, and some Pop Rocks. It's 1940. They probably didn't have any of that stuff. Some people believe that the lenticular clouds that are commonly seen gathering above Mount Shasta are engineered by the Lemurians to camouflage Aryan cargo ships docking at Telos. So I need to describe lenticular clouds. Many of you who possibly are well-versed in UFO or paranormal phenomena may already know what they are. Lenticular clouds is a cloud formation that almost looks saucer-shaped above very tall mountains. The height of the mountain creates a microclimate that makes these clouds. I'm paraphrasing it. It's probably way more scientific, but I'm just giving you an overview. These clouds are seen regularly above Mount Shasta. And it's thought that they are actually engineered to camouflage cargo ships that are docking to offload supplies to the Lemurians in the mountain. But if you have cargo ships docking to offload supplies, I don't know why you need to go into town to buy supplies at a general store and pay with gold. I'm not really sure. I'm just passing along the stories. That's all I'm doing. There's another description of the Lemurians that includes bandanas that they wear over their forehead to cover a third eye. though it isn't a literal eye. It's more like a walnut-sized sense organ in the middle of the forehead that allows them to communicate by ESP. It also allows them to appear and vanish at will. They also are listed as 7 feet tall and living in the volcano and paying for things with gold. I do want to point out that the little people or fairies of the mountain also have the ability to appear and disappear at will. Not making a giant connection. They're little people. These are 7 foot tall beings. But I just want to point out similarities when I can. So, in 1905, a man by the name of Frederick Oliver publishes a book called A Dweller on Two Planets. Oliver was born in Washington, D.C., and moved to California in 1866 with his parents at the age of 2. He was helping them mark the territory of their gold claim in the summer of 1883. He would jot down a number and location of stakes he drove into the survey line. At one point, he went to enter the information, and his hand began to write uncontrollably. Terrified, he ran the 2 miles back home. His mother got more paper, and he continued to write until the strange force left him. Over the next 3 years, his hand would be seized by unusual force and slowly write 1 or more pages. He finished the manuscript in 1895, and the book became one of the first occult classics. Oliver claimed he had been chosen as a secretary to Lemurian spirit Philos. Philos dictated the book to Oliver through the automatic writing. There were some parts of the book that detailed several inventions not yet known, such as anti-gravity mass transit, voice-operated typewriters, and cigar-shaped, highly maneuverable Atlantean flying machines that have an eerie resemblance to 20th century UFO reports. Then, in the LA Times, May 22nd, 1932, there was an article by Edward Lancer who talked about a business trip he took by train. He said that when the train passed Mount Shasta, he saw a reddish-green light on the whole southern side of the mountain. He asked the conductor if he knew what the source of the light was, and he was told matter-of-factly, "Lemurians. They hold ceremonies up there." On his return trip, Edward Lancer stopped near Shasta to learn more and discovered the existence of a mystic village on Mount Shasta. This was accepted fact by the area residents who attested to weird rituals that were performed on the mountain at sunset, midnight, and sunrise. Lancer himself witnessed a light show during his stay. Locals say that these mystery people used mystical powers to turn visitors away. There are several stories from the early days of automobiles. When motorists would reach a certain point on the road, a light would flash before their startled eyes, and the electrical systems of their car would stop working. When they would push the car back 100 feet or so, the engine would start. In addition to that, when forest fires have approached close to the forest near Mount Shasta, a strange fog has emerged in a circular manner, forming a wall around the region that the fire couldn't penetrate. People have also seen strange cattle emerging from the woods when they get to a certain point, and they believe that this is a sign or a way to frighten them so that they return back where they came from. According to the Hopi Indians, there's a race of lizard people who built 13 underground cities, one of which is supposed to be under Mount Shasta. These cities were built to escape a monster meteor shower. In 1972, a resident reported seeing a reptilian fellow in a shirt and trousers hiking Mount Shasta. This reminds me, I'm a huge X-Files fan. One of the more recent X-Files, in the last season that they did, there was an episode of a man who turned into a were-lizard. That's what I think of. Anyway, if I remember correctly, there was a mention of reptilians under Mount Hood in the UFO Ranch episode 3. These were reptilian aliens. I'm not certain if the reptilians mentioned by the Hopi were an alien race or something that was already existing on Earth. I also found a small mention of the Yoctavians, who were a tribe distinctly separate from the Lemurians, who were known as the greatest bell makers on Earth. They supposedly hollowed out the mountain with the sounds of their bells and chimes. It's a lot already. So we basically have a lot of Native American stories about grizzlies who could talk and walked on 2 legs, who married and had mixed race children with the Great Spirit's daughter, and this became the Indian race. And these grizzlies sound a lot like Bigfoot. And then you have this lost civilization, the Lemurians, who had to leave their homeland of Mu or Lemuria in the Pacific Ocean because it was going underwater. And the survivors from that ended up at Mount Shasta and created the city of Telos within the mountain. And we have some reptilians, and we have some bell makers. So that's what's going on so far. Mount Shasta is also home to a spiritual movement that is referred to as the I Am movement, which was started in the early 1930s when engineer Guy Ballard encountered the ascended master, Saint Germain, while climbing Mount Shasta. Ballard had been hiking quite a bit one day and stopped for lunch. He filled his cup from a nearby spring and felt an electric current pass through him from head to foot. He turned to look, and directly behind him was a young man who at first glance seemed like a fellow hiker, but upon closer inspection, it was revealed that he was no ordinary person. Why would he be an ordinary person on Mount Shasta? There doesn't seem to be anything ordinary about this mountain. So the mysterious man spoke. "If you will hand me your cup, I will give you a more refreshing drink than water." Ballard gave the man his cup, that was then filled with a creamy liquid, that he drank. Please, if you're hiking and a strange man shows up and says, "Let me give you something that's going to be a little bit better than water," and you give him your cup and you drink it, then you're crazy, because you don't do that. No candy from strangers. No crazy liquid creamy drinks from strangers. That's just no. So anyway, Ballard drinks it, and he says the taste was delicious and electrifying on the body and mind, and it made him gasp. The man said, "That which you drink comes directly from the universal supply." This was the first of many of Ballard's meetings with Saint Germain. The next day, after the meeting, Ballard was confronted by a large panther. He remembered Saint Germain's message of love and petted the beast, who began behaving like a house cat. Ballard ended up writing the book Unveiled Mysteries, and it spawned the cult of the I Amers. I Am teaches that each person has their own individual omnipresence, his or her own God self, with the potential to ascend to become a higher immortal form. At the height of its popularity, the I Am group had about 1 million followers. They were eventually charged by the U.S. government for swindling their followers out of millions of dollars, and the group fell into obscurity. It does seem that there are some people who follow the I Am movement still located in the Mount Shasta area. Of course, Mount Shasta is also known as a UFO hotspot. There are a ton of reports throughout the years of UFOs seen in that whole region. Not just on Mount Shasta, but in other areas rather close to Mount Shasta. I have pulled a few that were interesting that take place on or very close to the mountain itself. So the first one took place October 12th, 1956, and a gentleman by the name of David Williamson saw strange lights near the summit of Mount Shasta. David had been at his sister's house visiting. He left his sister's house to walk the short distance to his apartment when he saw an unusually bright star just above the summit of Mount Shasta. He wondered which star it could be, as it was brighter than any other star or planet that he had ever seen. As he watched, it began to move. He yelled for his sister to come outside to see what was going on, but she either didn't hear him or didn't care, and never came out. He ended up going into his apartment, and he continued watching the strange light from there using his binoculars. With the binoculars, he could see the light was actually caused by a set of 4 lights in a diamond shape, connected to one another by lines of light like fluorescent tubes or neon lights. 2 nights later, David saw the same group of lights in the sky, only this time it was 14 lights grouped into 2 rows, having the appearance of looking at a lighted room through windows. Over several minutes, he noticed the formation of the lights changed 4 separate times. A few minutes later, he saw a UFO descend from the sky and come below the summit of Mount Shasta's peak and hover there. So that was the end of David Williamson's There's actually some speculation that the light formations that he was seeing was actually a portal that was opening up to allow the UFO to descend out of down to the mountain. The next one that I want to talk about involves a police officer named Jack Brown, who actually had two separate encounters while he was on patrol. One happened in 1960 and the other happened in 1966. August of 1960, a fellow police officer, Pete Chinka, spotted a UFO and radioed into the station. Officer Brown was told to look out the window of the station, and when he did, he observed a UFO to the east. At the same time, several people had called into the police to report the sighting. Officer Brown leaves the police station to see what's going on. There's a small crowd watching the saucer flying and hovering above the National Guard Armory for close to 45 minutes. With Officers Brown and Chinko on scene, the object began to move north, so Officer Brown followed it north up the mountain in his patrol car. He had the craft in his sights about 50 feet above his car when his car died. He got out and watched it fly off towards the mountain. This was all recorded in his official police report, a report that cannot be found now. Police logs from Mount Shasta City go back to 1914 and cover up to 1975, but oddly, the years 1956 through 1975 are missing, the same years many sightings were reported. There was a military investigation, and there were complaints that the military partook in invasive questioning of witnesses that went on for years. The second sighting that involved Officer Brown, who has now been promoted and is Captain Brown, took place July 3, 1966, around 3 a.m. While he was on duty patrolling the city limits of Mount Shasta, Captain Brown first observed the object through the patrol car's windshield. It was closing in on him rapidly on what looked like a collision course with the patrol car. Captain Brown swerved violently, barely missing a ditch, and came to an abrupt halt. He got out of his patrol car and leaned on the door in case he needed to escape on foot if the UFO got hostile. The craft was a smooth disc, 30 to 40 feet in diameter and 10 to 12 feet thick. It hovered silently, 20 to 30 feet above the police car, and emitted a blue-white glow that was the brightest along the disc's rim. The intensity of the light hurt Brown's eyes as he looked at the disc. There were no visible windows or openings. On its underside were two thick tubular protrusions that were curved and tapered about 8 inches around at the ends. They were skid-like in appearance, but had no perceived function, he detected. He detected no exhaust trails. It lingered 3 to 4 minutes and then drifted off, as if nonchalantly surveying the immediate area. It suddenly shot off towards the slopes of Mount Shasta, where it stopped and hovered again before shooting off a second time, climbing over the mountain and vanishing. Brown had contacted his dispatcher while this was going on, and the dispatcher looked out the window and also witnessed the craft as it moved off towards the mountain. The dispatcher was not able to see its interaction with the patrol car because the landscape hid it from view. Captain Brown said later that he would be reluctant to report any future sightings because of the way the Air Force handled his first report in 1960. The Air Force insisted on him completing many tedious, irrelevant forms and report sheets before informing him that what he and his fellow officers had seen was something other than what they had described. Shocker. So then in November 26, 1966, same year, pilot Jack Brown saw a saucer-shaped object from his single-engine plane flying over Mount Shasta. He stated that it was headed east to west at an estimated 300 to 400 miles per hour. This is not the same Jack Brown that I just talked about, who was the police officer, and they are in no way related to one another. It's just coincidence. These next sightings occurred between the years 1964 and 1985. The United States Forest Service fire officer trained in long-distance visual observation was a 53-year veteran of the Forest Service serving on fire watch in Siskiyou County, has observed many different things: fires, storms, helicopters, airplanes, satellites, the space station, tons of things. She's trained in skills needed to do her duties, such as directing fire units to areas of smoke or flame and tracking lightning storms. 1964, she's stationed at Herd Peak on Miller Mountain. She was looking towards Mount Shasta's northwest side around twilight or dusk, and observed a ball of light above the timberline by the Hotlum area of Mount Shasta. Suddenly, she viewed a rectangular door opening and closing on the side of the mountain. A ball of light either entered or left when the door was closed. In the late 70s, early 80s, in the summer, while she was on lookout duties, a craft appeared about 10,000 feet up. It had visible square openings on the side, and she said it looked like a train passenger car going around a curve, moving up and down and side to side. The distortions that are similar to that of heat making the air look wavy seemed to make the windows look wavy as well. It was spinning clockwise while heading towards Mount Shasta. The portholes looked multicolored, red, blue, and white, and had some type of aura or energy wave around it, distorting the vision. The craft disappeared when it was near the top side of the Shastina cone of Mount Shasta. The same witness saw other various things throughout the years. Some looked like orange lights bobbing up and down, then disappearing into the mountain. She also saw, near the Hotlum area of Mount Shasta, orange lights of one craft that would just hang out there and observe when planes came by. When the plane would get close, it would cloak itself, then decloak when the plane had passed. She also observed a large bright red ball shoot straight up. Another lookout saw it and said it seemed to have come out of the ground. As the two lookouts watched, the ball of light shot straight out, stopping halfway between both towers, then reversing course, heading straight back and disappearing into the ground. So when I say lookout, they're like on watchtowers. They are looking for the beginnings of wildfires. They have binoculars. As I said, they're trained in long-distance visual skills. They need to be able to spot the wildfire. They need to be able to tell the responding fire department how to get there. So they're highly trained Forest Service personnel. These aren't just your regular run-of-the-mill people. In 1974, a forester working planting trees saw many UFOs in the evening and had run close to one that was cloaked but was very noisy, which is a little bit odd because most people report not hearing any noise at all. He said it took off, making a whoosh sound and moving bushes and blew his hair. It rose with a warm rush of air as he heard it take off. So he didn't see this particular one because it was cloaked or invisible. In 1976, a railroad engineer went up Mount Shasta and saw a large craft that was yellow with white rim lights. It looked like a bee bouncing along peaks slowly for a few minutes before shooting into space at a high rate of speed and was gone in seconds. In 1980, a homeowner in Mount Shasta City and a guest saw 3 orange balls with white outlines going over Mount Shasta at about 300 miles per hour north to south. They actually called in a police report. They said it also was in a triangular pattern with a white outer rim and saw it for several minutes. In Mount Shasta City in 1982, there was a witness who said they could not sleep, so they had gone outside to get some air. It was August, and it was a clear night. They were looking up at the mountain and saw a low-flying disk that was bright as a full moon just above the trees. It hovered there for a bit and then took off at a high rate of speed. It was approximately 40 feet in diameter and shot towards the west out of sight and made no sound. In October of 1992, a man and a friend traveled to an area with a clear line of sight of the sky and the sheer wall of Mount Shasta. They're in the back of their pickup truck looking up at the sky, stargazing. Then, above their head, appears 3 stars forming a perfect equilateral triangle. After several minutes, each star would blink. They could see something slow down in the middle until it finally materialized into a disk, looking like it had just emerged from a wormhole. It made a perfect right-angle turn and sped into the side of the mountain. It happened again with the second craft. Each looked like the color of coffee with cream before changing to silver. They made the distinction of saying it appeared like they were watching the atoms of these crafts reassembling as it came out of the wormhole. 2 to 3 years after this sighting, while cleaning a house, one of the witnesses noticed a photo on the mantle of the house that they were cleaning that showed the same type of star pattern. The homeowner came in and said, "That's a stargate on the northeast side of the mountain." The homeowner said she's been watching ships come out of there since she was a little girl. The equilateral triangle, the 3 stars, that is something that I actually witnessed at the UFO ranch. Summer of 2003, Mount Shasta resident and his girlfriend were driving on a summer night when they pulled over on the side of the road to park, or neck, whatever. And they exited their car and they were sitting on the hood talking and stargazing. I bet they were talking. They noticed movement in the sky fairly high up, but low enough to see. It was a craft with 3 lights in a triangular pattern. They watched it fly across the sky, taking about 3 minutes to reach the horizon. April 2009 in McLeod, California. A woman named Rosemary Carey worked on the McLeod River Railroad's diner car, and often her husband would come and meet her and take her home after work. On this particular night in April, they had 2 vehicles, so each drove home, and her husband, he was following behind her. While she's driving home, she notices that her husband is flashing his lights, so she stops to see what he wants. He points to the sky and an object he saw. She comments to him that it's most likely a satellite, but as they watch, it suddenly moved low and came to a stop not too far above the trees. Her husband commented later that he thought it was a helicopter about to crash. The craft quickly left, and Rosemary and her husband rushed home in the same direction as the mysterious object. As they drove, they saw the object continue, clearly seeing that it wasn't a helicopter on fire. The object stopped again, pausing several seconds, then turned sharply to the left and took off to the east. They arrive home, and Rosemary heads inside until her husband yells to her that there's another strange craft. It had come from the western sky, traveling fast. It was 150 feet above their house, nearly skimming the tops of the trees. Rosemary's husband grabbed his binoculars from the garage. Their dogs were going crazy, though she said she couldn't be certain if it was because of the strange craft or because they hadn't been greeted yet. Trust me, if my dog knows that I'm home and I don't come in right away, she really gets irritated. Rosemary calls her kids in another part of town. Her daughter and son-in-law go outside of their house, and they also see the craft. At this point, Rosemary's husband is able to get a good look at the thing. He said he wasn't able to fit the entire object in the view of the binoculars because it was so close. It looked like a giant jellyfish. It was a translucent dome about the size of half a house, bright with some small highlights of orange and red tones, but mostly the light was a light purple hue and glowing. In the middle of it was an intense blazing fire, but with the flames mostly contained or going up, not going sideways or down, like it was powering something in the same way a hot air balloon is powered. There was no noise at all, even though it was so close to the house. They heard nothing. It hovered above them for 5 to 8 minutes before slowly beginning to meander off. It stopped at a road and hovered for a few seconds before leaving the same way the first craft had left, heading east with sudden motion, turning left, then shooting off and disappearing. The next day, Rosemary mentioned what they had seen to some of the locals, and both people at the local bank and at her place of employment informed her of seeing the same thing. Several longtime locals, an adult male, and 3 to 4 kids in a park had all seen the same thing as well. Just a reminder that Darkness Radio host Dave Schrader witnessed a jellyfish-like object at the UFO ranch in Washington that we mentioned in episode 3. And this particular sighting, you had Rosemary and her husband. While they're at their house, she calls her daughter. Her daughter and son-in-law come outside. They see it. They're in another town. They're in another area. They see it. You have people who worked at the bank, people who were at her place of employment at the diner. They see it. Several other locals, an adult male, and several kids also see it. This was a massively huge sighting in this town called McLeod, which is not too far from the base of Mount Shasta. So now we're going to move into the other interesting sightings that are seen around Mount Shasta, and I'm, of course, talking about the elusive bipedal man-ape creature known as Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, whichever one you want to call him by. What's that joke? Sasquatch is sometimes called Bigfoot, yet he never complains. California it's not really surprising that Mount Shasta would also have a ton of sightings of Bigfoot. California in general is ranked second after Washington State for the number of reported Bigfoot sightings. The Karuk tribe seems to have some type of bond with the Bigfoot creature, as there have been many reported sightings on their reservation, possibly because Bigfoot understands that the Native Americans have a respect and sacred acceptance of them. The Mattacogni are Bigfoot reported to live near Mount Shasta. There are tales of how friendly the creatures are and that sometimes the Native Americans would trade with them. They are 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in coarse hair, have brown eyes, and give off a musky odor. Sometime in 1900, there was a Modoc Indian who was trekking Mount Shasta when he was bitten by a rattlesnake. He was rescued by 3 of these Mattacogni creatures who treated his snakebite. Way better than the Bigfoot creatures that take you and eat you or whatever it is that they do with you. In 1962, there was a woman who claimed to see a Bigfoot give birth in the Mount Shasta wilderness. There was no mention of her name and no other details, so take it with a grain of salt. But that's interesting. I've never actually heard of any other story of somebody witnessing a Bigfoot giving birth. In 1976, a camper thought that a ranger had walked past his camp, but when he went outside to see what the ranger wanted, he ended up spotting a Bigfoot-like creature walking away. Again in 1976, a man by the name of Virgil Larson, who was a logger from Idaho, was working on a logging operation on Mount Shasta. Around 8:30 a.m., he and a friend and fellow worker, Pat Conway, were making their way down the slope to the log landing where they worked. It was not an easy hike. The loggers parked on the road above and had made a crude trail down the slope to the work area. The 2 men had to stop to take a break during their hike. They had also gotten separated by the trees, though they could hear each other. Larson heard what sounded like a third person hiking down, and he thought it might be a Forest Service ranger. Larson shouted to the man, but got no response. The man seemed to walk behind a bush and then turned towards Larson. Larson shouted again, and that's when the creature revealed itself. It smelled terrible, even at 30 yards away. Larson ran. He later returned to the area with Pat Conway, and there was no creature, but the smell lingered. It was estimated that the creature was 7 to 7.5 feet tall. The Forest Service would also later investigate the area, though they found little. Just undefined footprints, blood smeared on some branches, and a vague smell in the air, but nothing conclusive. The creature had been about 15 yards east of the rough trail the loggers had made. Its hair started at its eyebrows and went straight back. It was not combed and dirty. That particular incident is interesting because it's in dense forest. Loggers have a lot of reported Bigfoot sightings, probably because they're in thick forested areas. Not a lot of people go to those areas, so that's probably why they see quite a bit. It's interesting that the Forest Service took this serious enough to actually do an investigation of their own. So in 1995, a man was snowboarding on Mount Shasta. He had camped out the night before, and he had gotten up early that morning before the sun rose because he was cold, and he decided just to get up and head out downhill. Even though there was no sun, there was still plenty of light because of the reflection of the snow. So if you ever go out at night when there's a lot of snow on the ground, the moon and starlight actually reflects quite a bit. That snow reflects any little bit of light that it has, and you actually can see quite a bit. As he was going through the timber, he saw something out of the corner of his eye and stopped. 80 meters below him, he saw a tan, ash, gray-colored, hairy creature. He was downwind from the creature, but noticed no odor. The creature turned and saw him and ran off on 2 legs. It had no trouble running through the snow, even though it was about 2 to 3 feet deep. The witness said the profile of the creature closely resembled artist drawings of Neanderthal man. It was a massive creature, taller than 6 feet and more than 260 pounds, at his estimation. In 1996, a woman's daughter came in the house around 9 or 10 p.m., scared of a big smelly creature she saw outside. The woman's brother who lived down the road described a large bear-like creature that was shaking his trailer at night, hard enough to wake him up. Big smelly creature. That could be anybody. I've seen a couple of those myself. They're scary. Winter of 1997, a person went up Mount Shasta to cross-country ski. Around 2 p.m., he saw a Bigfoot tearing up a wood log looking for food. The witness bolted downhill before the creature saw him. He said his brother had had a similar experience 4 years prior in the exact same area. Now this one is an interesting case. This happened January of 2000. A man was driving his son to a basketball tournament when he noticed what he thought was a person with a huge backpack heading down the hill along the road. Whatever it was moved rapidly and jumped boldly onto the freeway. The man said to his son, "I think we're going to see a drunk person get lit up by oncoming traffic." As they watched, they were able to see it wasn't a person at all, but a 7-foot-tall creature covered in white hair. It had a graceful gait, and it took only 4 strides to cross the freeway. Now that's 2 encounters now that have mentioned a different color other than the brown or black that's typically associated with Bigfoot or Sasquatch. This one was white hair, and then the other gentleman who saw it while snowboarding said that it was like tan or ash gray, that sort of light-colored fur, hair, whatever, which is typically associated more like with a Yeti. I don't know, maybe they're like snowshoe hares, and in the wintertime, their fur changes to a whiter color in order to be able to blend more with the surroundings. I have no idea. I don't think anybody has any idea what Bigfoot does. Bigfoots or big feet or Bigfoot. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what happens to them in the wintertime. This last Bigfoot encounter story took place sometime in the 2000s. I don't know specifically when. And it happened to a boy named Tony, and he had his Bigfoot sighting at the age of 13 just south of Mount Shasta. He was camping in early June with his grandparents, who he had been visiting with for the summer. The campsite was flat, but was covered in thick forest. About 20 feet to the right, there was a small creek or stream that ran next to the campsite. He went over to play in it, as kids do, sometimes adults do, and he started following the creek. He ended up encountering a large hairy creature drinking by scooping the water up with his hand. Now, I thought that was an interesting part of the story. The creature wasn't leaning forward drinking water with its mouth directly from the creek. It was actually crouched and using one of its hands to scoop water up, which would rule out just about any animal we know. Bears aren't going to do that. I don't know of any animal that would do that except maybe a raccoon, but I don't think a raccoon would drink water that way. They just play in the water. So he observed the creature for about 30 seconds until the creature saw him, stood up, made eye contact, then ran off. He could hear it continuing to run through the woods. The creature was 6 to 7 feet tall, and its hair was light brownish. Looking at it from the side, the hair was all over its body, and it was long. He was about 10 feet from the creature when he saw it, and he screamed and ran back to camp. He believes that he surprised it because the sound of the water over the rocks was loud, and he was actually walking in the water. The weather that day was sunny and about 80 degrees. Later that same day, his grandmother took a walk along the creek and ended up in the area where he had seen the creature. She saw a footprint, but they had no way to make any kind of cast of it. He's camped there 2 other times since, but has never had any kind of experience since then. So with all this, including strange fires, blue and white lights, strange chanting and singing and weird, beautiful music, there's no denying that there's something strange and otherworldly about Mount Shasta. People say it has an aura about it and a strange magnetic pull. And yes, there actually are magnetic anomalies in the area. In fact, there's a whole lot of other strangeness that's associated with it. But as I said, I had to stop going down the rabbit holes, get this episode thrown together so I could get it recorded for you for Friday. People flock to Mount Shasta. They come here for spiritual growth and healing. There are Mount Shasta Vortex tours. They're guided tours that are taken up to the mountain. None of them go up to the summit. You need a specialized guide for that. They don't do the Vortex tours for that, but they do tour the lower areas below 9,000 feet of Mount Shasta. And there's a lot of metaphysical stores in the area, a lot of what people call woo-woo. And I do not say woo-woo in any kind of derogatory way whatsoever. It's just the easiest way to describe it. There's a lot of new age, that would be the better word. There's a lot of new age type stores, and people claim that when they come to this area, they feel as if they've been called there. One person said they felt like that somebody had spoken to them telepathically that said, "Welcome home." People just seem to be drawn to this area for some reason. Is it visitors from other worlds? Lost ancient civilizations inside the mountain? I don't really know. I don't think we're ever really going to know the answer. But who knows? Maybe. Stranger things have happened the past couple years. So that's going to do it for this episode. Remember, you can find all our episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcast or at lurkpodcast.com. You can find links to all of our social media platforms on the website. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Please take a moment to follow or like us or subscribe, whatever it is that you do. We also have merch that you can find at lurkpodcastmerch.com. Purchasing t-shirts with the logo, hoodies, that sort of thing, helps the podcast pay for itself. So that's going to do it. And until next time, keep lurking.